There's a city in central Russia most of the world couldn't find on a map. For years, the people who live there watched this war from a safe distance. Over 1,000 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-held ground, tucked deep inside the Republic of Tatarstan, farther from the front than Moscow itself. On the morning of August 10, 2026, that distance stopped mattering. Sirens first, then the low buzz of engines overhead, then fire. By the time the smoke cleared, one of Russia's most advanced oil refineries was burning, and 13 people were dead. This is the story of Nizhnekamsk, a name almost no one outside Russia knew a week ago, and one that now tells us exactly where this war is heading next. Before we get into the strategy behind it, we need to be honest about the human cost. Real people died that morning, in a city that had spent 4 years believing it was untouchable. That part of the story comes first. By mid-morning, Ukrainian drones had struck deep into Tatarstan, hitting both industrial and civilian sites across the city. Regional authorities said at least 13 people were killed, including a child, with reporting on the wounded ranging between roughly 39 and 78 people, depending on the source and how the count was updated over the following hours. 9 of the 13 killed were reportedly staying at a hostel that was hit directly. 7 of the dead were identified as Uzbek nationals, according to Uzbekistan's consulate in the region, and a Tajik citizen was also among the victims. Russian investigators opened a criminal case, describing it as a terrorist attack. This was, by multiple independent counts, among the deadliest single strikes inside Russia in the more than 4 years of this war. That's the human weight of what happened. Now let's look at the strategic story underneath it, because Nizhnekamsk wasn't an isolated strike. It was one point inside something much larger, one of the broadest coordinated drone operations of the entire war. Here's a number you're going to see everywhere in coverage of this night: 456. That figure comes directly from Russia's own Ministry of Defense, and it's important to understand exactly what it means. It's not a claim about a single swarm descending on one target. It's Russia's own count of how many Ukrainian drones its air defenses say they intercepted overnight, spread across somewhere between 15 and 17 different regions of the country, plus occupied Crimea. Russia's statement doesn't say how many drones got through. But sit with what that number is actually claiming for a second, because in some ways it's more alarming than the version that gets exaggerated in headlines. Russia is saying that in a single night, it was defending against Ukrainian drone activity across more than 15 separate regions simultaneously, from areas near the Ukrainian border all the way out to Tatarstan, roughly 1,000 kilometers deep into the country. Not one strike, an entire country having to respond at once. There's a tactical reason that matters beyond the raw number. Ukraine's long-range strike units have been open about mixing decoy drones into these raids alongside armed ones. Cheap, unarmed airframes that look identical to weapons on a radar screen. Defenders have no reliable way to distinguish one from the other at the moment, which means every single track has to be treated as a potential threat. Crews scramble, interceptors burn fuel, radars light up, sometimes just to shoot down an empty decoy. That's the underlying trap in this kind of large-scale drone campaign. The more drones sent at once, the more of the defenders' limited resources get pulled into the air, and the more likely it becomes that some of the real, armed drones slip through in the noise. Where the deepest strike actually landed is what makes this particular night so significant for Russia's war economy. Nizhnekamsk isn't a random target. It's home to Tatnef's TANECO refinery, one of the newest, most technologically advanced refineries in the country, with a reported annual throughput of around 16 to 17 million tons of crude oil, alongside a major petrochemical complex. Ukraine's general staff said its forces struck the refinery directly and confirmed a fire at the site. This wasn't the facility's first encounter with Ukrainian strikes either. It had reportedly been hit once before, in June of this year. But for most of the war, this particular region had felt insulated by sheer distance. This time, the strike arrived as part of a much larger, coordinated national barrage. So why does a refinery more than 1,000 kilometers from the front line matter enough for Ukraine to reach that far? Because refineries are the connective tissue of a war economy. They turn crude oil into the diesel and gasoline that move tanks, trucks, and aircraft, and into the refined exports that help fund the invasion. That's been the core logic behind Ukraine's refinery campaign throughout 2026. Choke the fuel supply, and you choke both the military logistics and the revenue behind them. How much lasting damage this specific strike caused to the TANECO facility isn't fully clear yet. Ukraine reported a fire, and a full damage assessment will take time. But the reach involved in getting a strike capability out to Tatarstan simply didn't exist a couple of years ago. Ukraine built that reach from scratch. At the center of that capability is a domestically produced drone Ukraine calls the Lyuty, a propeller-driven, one-way attack aircraft designed by Antonov, with a reported range between roughly 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers and a unit cost estimated around $200,000. That's remarkably cheap for something capable of flying that far. And Ukraine isn't producing these one at a time. According to one major manufacturer, the country is now turning out roughly 200 long-range strike drones per day, with capacity to scale further. The trajectory shows up clearly in Russia's own numbers. Ukrainian drone attacks reportedly rose from around 6,000 in 2024 to more than 23,000 in 2025, better than a four-fold increase in a single year. Back in March of this year, one of Russia's most senior security officials, speaking publicly in the Urals region, made an admission Moscow had spent years avoiding: that no region of Russia is fully immune to Ukrainian drone strikes anymore. Nizhnekamsk is what that admission looks like in practice. But the deeper story of August 10th isn't really about any single refinery. It's about the map. Think about the underlying problem this creates for Russian defense planners. In one night, Ukrainian drones forced a response across more than 15 regions simultaneously, from the border zone all the way to the deep interior. Now stretch that challenge across the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones. Moscow has to think about protecting the capital, its strategic air bases, its refineries, its ports, its military production facilities, and any of them could, in principle, become the next target. Russia's air defense network is more sophisticated than simply moving a single system from city to city reactively, but the underlying geographic problem doesn't disappear. No country, regardless of resources, can provide equal density of protection to every strategic asset across that much territory at once. Russia's sheer size has always been one of its core defensive advantages: space to disperse assets, relocate production, and absorb losses that would cripple a smaller country. But long-range drone strikes are steadily eroding the protective value of that distance. And that, more than any single burning refinery, is what a night like August 10th is really demonstrating. The zone Russia could once treat as comfortably beyond Ukraine's reach keeps shrinking. Ukraine's homegrown long-range drones have pushed past 2,000 kilometers this year, with the deepest strikes reportedly reaching as far as Siberia. Against that backdrop, a city roughly 1,000 kilometers from the border no longer counts as a safe distance. It's important, though, not to let the strategic framing obscure what happened on the ground. 13 people are dead. Civilian areas of Nizhnekamsk were hit directly, not just industrial infrastructure. Russian investigators have opened a case describing it as a terrorist attack. Ukraine, for its part, has consistently argued that energy infrastructure fueling Russia's war economy represents a legitimate military target. And it's worth noting that Russia's own invasion has killed Ukrainian civilians at a far larger scale over the course of this war. Neither of those broader arguments changes what happened to the people killed and wounded in Nizhnekamsk that morning. As long-range strikes push deeper into both countries, the physical distance separating the battlefield from ordinary civilian life keeps narrowing on both sides. And that narrowing has a real human cost each time it happens. So let's be precise about what August 10th does and doesn't tell us. Russia says it intercepted 456 drones that night. Its air defense network has not collapsed, and a single burning refinery, however significant, will not by itself decide the outcome of this war. But that was never really the test Ukraine appears to be running. The actual test is whether this kind of operation can be sustained, night after night, region after region, a refinery 1,000 kilometers away one night, a different target from a different direction the next. Ukraine doesn't need every drone launched to get through. It needs enough of them, often enough, to keep forcing Russian commanders into an impossible set of choices about what gets protected and what gets left exposed. That's how this kind of pressure campaign actually works. Not through one dramatic night, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of many of them. For the people living around refineries like this one, the abstraction ends there. A war that had played out on television for 4 years arrived directly overhead. And for towns like Nizhnekamsk, there's now a real possibility that the next raid is already somewhere in the air. What do you think this means for how the rest of this war plays out? Does deep strike pressure like this actually change Russia's calculus? Or does it mainly increase the human cost without shifting the broader trajectory of the conflict? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure you're subscribed for continued coverage as this story develops.